and this is Changing the Narrative. I'm your host, David Rives, and we are changing the narrative every day. We've been spoon-fed a narrative of naturalism, a narrative of atheism, a narrative that tells us that we are nothing more than cosmic accidents, blips on the map that just come and go, and that's all there is to life. Well, we're changing the narrative in a big way, and we're changing it back to truth. That's right, the truth of God's Word. And I have with me today a good friend, Dr. Joe Deweese. We've known each other for years, but I have waited a long time to have him on the podcast. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be here with you, David.
It is great to have you on. Now, you have done a lot of research. You're actually fellow Tennessean here.
Yep.
Just about an hour and a half down the road.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Southern Illinois, Troy, Illinois. It's a little kind of farming town. Grew up there, just got interested in science and passionate about design and creation, and decided to pursue that in college. So I did my undergraduate work at Freed-Hardeman University, where I also met and married my wife, Liz. And then we moved to Dixon, Tennessee, where you are now. We lived here for about 17 years while I did my graduate work at Vanderbilt University. So I have a PhD in biochemistry from Vanderbilt. I taught pharmacy education for 12 years, so taught biochemistry and pharmacology to pharmacy students at Lipscomb. And then for the last almost 3 years now, have been back at Freed-Hardeman University teaching biochemistry and molecular biology, and also a course on Bible and science.
That is amazing. So, there's a lot of connections, too.
Yes.
There are a ton of connections. Well, number one, I was in Allen Arena this morning. I left about 4:30 a.m. to try to get to an event. But we did not meet at Lipscomb. We did not meet.
That's right.
We met in the most unusual of places
That's right.
in, what was it, Myrtle Beach,
I think
South
it was Myrtle
Carolina.
Beach. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And out of all of the people who were there, when it came time for lunch, I was thinking, you know what? I'm kind of just all alone here, no common ground. And come to find out, after meeting you, you were like, well, I'm from Tennessee. Well, I'm from Tennessee. And you do some fascinating research. I just want you to tease for just a moment topoisomerase.
Okay.
Just give me a 30-second teaser.
Sure. So the DNA in your cells is incredibly long. It's about 6 feet worth in every cell. It gets tangled up just like you can imagine telephone cords and wires and cables like you have here. Topoisomerases are enzymes at work in the nucleus of your cells to untangle DNA. Keep it from it. I have a mentor of mine used to say it's the only enzyme that can render DNA invisible to itself.
Wow. I love it. I love it. And there's a lot of research involved, but we'll get into that more in a moment. Tell me, you are changing the narrative because you are doing scientific research that is pointing to design and complexity, right?
Sure.
And that's something that a lot of people, especially today in science, a lot of people, when they study a particular field, they're like, how do we explain this fully through naturalism? And they start with that mindset and they end with that mindset after jumping through hoops and reinterpreting scientific data to try to fit, right? But you're not really doing that. You're actually doing real research, and we appreciate that about you.
Well, thank you. Well, so I would say this, in science, the paradigm, the naturalistic paradigm, is taken for granted. Okay. It's assumed to be true. And in all of our education, the way that graduate school, things like that work, it's all assumed to be true. Yeah. It's there. It's, this must be the way it is. And so as a student going through that, you're kind of assumed that you're going to just mold into that mindset and fit that mindset. And I know a lot of students that they weren't necessarily thinking about the philosophy of it. They were just interested in, just the science and understanding, how the world works, not so much where it came from, but it all comes together. And so we have to understand that as we explore the way the world works, how we think about where it came from matters, because it influences the decisions we make about the assumptions about whether something's important or not, whether something's meaningful or not. If I assume the system was designed, I will come to different conclusions than if I assume it evolved.
Okay, but if we were to look back just a few hundred years, we would find that naturalism is not the case, right? That a lot of things...
Yes.
From a scientific perspective,
it was not the reigning paradigm.
It was not the reigning paradigm, right?
That's right.
Is peer pressure a part of that?
Is peer pressure a part of that? Yes, in the sense that, it's assumed that if you're in this arena that you're going to fit this particular mold. And here's where it comes from, David. It comes from this idea that when we study things using the methods of science, there's an underlying, unstated, unspoken assumption that the only means by which those things could come about is natural.
Right.
And so if I start with that assumption, then I have to interpret everything I find in light of that.
Okay.
And so as we train our students to be scientists, if we train them to assume that all of this had to have a natural cause or explanation, then that's the only option, and that becomes the only game in town. Now, like you said, it hasn't been like that for necessarily that long, but with the slide of, you had Charles Lyell in geology, kind of bringing about this idea of vast ages. I think I have that right.
Right.
And then, you go to Darwin and him saying, okay, not only could you have vast ages, but what if there wasn't this stasis of organisms, right? His real argument was against fixity of species, which we would not agree with either.
Exactly.
But his point was maybe these organisms could all have come from a single source, coalesced back together in deep time.
And that's the idea known as universal common descent,
That's right? That's
Darwinian evolution in its classical form, if you're talking about the idea that there could be different species, we would agree with that.
Yeah, sure.
But if you're talking about everything in the universe originating from one single point of origin, universal common descent, then there's no scientific evidence for that whatsoever. And to say that this is a form of science is actually a form of pseudoscience, because what you're doing is you're having to break natural laws to produce life from non-living things.
That's fair. I think the way that it would be characterized by those that disagree with us would be to say, they see patterns of nested hierarchies in the genomes of organisms. In other words, you can organize, let's say, if you just use genetics for a moment, you can organize the genomes of organisms into what appears to be some sort of kind of nested hierarchy. And if that's the case, let's say among humans and apes and chimps, and what about other organisms? And you build out this greater idea that maybe these all coalesce back together. And so from that perspective, they would say, yes, there's evidence. But we would say, well, that's one interpretation.
Sure.
Right? But there are other interpretations that could give you a nested hierarchy. We could organize the cars in the parking lot into a nested hierarchy based upon their design, but that wouldn't necessarily mean they evolved from one another.
No. And you're starting with intelligence, right?
That's right.
Even for us to be able to recognize a nested hierarchy involves intelligence, and that's something that we don't see. Usually language comes from a mind. Yeah. And I would argue that DNA is an information language system.
Right. Yeah.
And therefore, it must have come from a mind.
Yeah.
The mind of the creator.
We have to have a source.
It has to have a source, right? So what about the objection that the design perspective, that looking at all of nature, and instead of saying, look at what Mother Nature has done, which is basically deifying nature.
Yes.
Instead of saying, wow, everything can be explained naturalistically without the need for God. What about the objection? Well, when you put God in the picture, or you put intelligent design in the picture, when you insert any of those types of ideas, you're not making testable predictions.
Yeah, this is the big objection right now that you hear from folks, even folks that would maybe align with us from a faith perspective, but maybe choose to believe in theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism. The big objection to design is it doesn't make any predictions.
Yeah.
And what they've done is they've created this view of science where an idea is only valid or useful or helpful if it makes predictions. And I understand that concept, but I would say that's not necessarily the whole weight of an idea or a concept or an explanatory framework. Right. There are explanatory frameworks that, yes, would make predictions, but there are also explanatory frameworks that could be open to multiple possible, interpretations of predictions. So here's the challenge we deal with. God's word is not a science textbook.
Right.
It gives us information about what happened in the beginning, but not on a detailed level like we might prefer. And so as a result, we don't know the exact starting conditions. And therefore, the predictions we make have to be tentative based upon observation. Now, I'll say in more recent years, there have been a number of ways that folks from a design perspective have predicted things that have actually come true.
Okay.
So if you take just for a moment back to DNA, only a small amount of our DNA, let's say about 1.5 to 2%, encodes proteins, which we know to be kind of the workhorses of the cells. The topoisomerases, the polymerases, the enzymes involved in metabolism are all encoded by a very small section of our DNA.
Okay.
There are some other regions that we know are involved in different things, but there appeared, at least in, let's say, the 70s, 80s, 90s, there appeared to be this vast amount of DNA that we didn't know what it did.
Okay.
So the evolutionary interpretation was that must be left over from kind of the process of evolution.
Right.
Maybe it's leftover evolutionary baggage.
The idea of junk DNA.
That's junk DNA, exactly. Okay. And so that's where that term kind of got coined, is this idea that it's there, but it's the junk of evolution that's just left in our genomes. But you can look back in the literature, and I know for sure in the 90s and maybe even as far back as the 80s, there were folks from a design perspective saying, we don't necessarily think this is junk. We actually need to look at this. But the problem was that paradigm, that evolutionary paradigm, junk DNA paradigm, took such a powerful hold that DNA was not examined until the early 2000s at great detail.
So Joe, you're saying that actually looking at it from that paradigm was holding back scientific progress because it was assumed to be useless, remnants where evolution was not elegant in the way that it coded the DNA. And it's holding back scientific progress.
It held back scientific progress. And we sequenced the genome, from the late 90s into the early 2000s. They completed the Human Genome Project, and then they started what they called the ENCODE Project. It stands for Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, where they looked outside of those protein coding regions and then within the protein coding regions in the introns in those various genes. And they said, what are these other sequences doing that make up the bulk of our genome? And they published their first kind of dump of papers, this huge, massive kind of data dump, I think around 2012, if I remember correctly. And in one of the kind of seminal papers of that group, they made the point that they could assign biochemical functions to over 80% of the genome.
Wow.
Meaning we'd gone from a world where maybe a few percent to maybe 10 or 12% of our genome was considered functional to now over 80%.
Is that?
And the number was rising,
Right, so. because and tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like the more scientific discovery that takes place, pretty much every month, every week, sometimes multiple times per week, there are breaking new discoveries in genetics and biology, and each one is pointing back towards this sort of complexity. That's right. And it seems towards this design perspective.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I've watched this trend over the last number of years of observations where, the initial thought I had as a graduate student was everything's pointing away. Yeah. But what I've seen since then is really things are pointing more and more toward. We saw that, and I think that's true of the discussion around Adam and Eve. If we'd had this discussion 9 or so years ago, the discussion at that point was that humanity could have been no fewer than a population of 10,000 individuals.
Okay.
And those individuals evolved out of some population of ape-like ancestors. And it would have never been smaller than that.
Okay.
Well, you fast forward till just a few years ago, and that idea was challenged and said, really, we've never actually looked at that from a mathematical population genetic perspective to actually demonstrate that really robustly. Yeah. And as the study started doing that, what they found is that actually, yes, you can get from a population of 2 starting out, you can get the genetic diversity we have today. Now, some of the initial calculations were that might take 500,000 years. Right. Well, those depending upon assumptions, those numbers have gotten smaller and smaller.
Okay.
And even in that some of that work was published by Ann Gager and Ola Hoscher in Biocomplexity a few years ago, but more recently in a more mainstream kind of secular journal. There was a publication back in September of this past year, 2023, where basically scientists said, hey, we've done the math on this. There was a population bottleneck where there was an average of 1,280 individuals in humanity evolving for a period of maybe 100,000 years. Okay, if you have an average of 1,280 over 100,000 years, that means it could have been 2. There's no difference mathematically. So, so in other words, you could have had as few as 2 people somewhere in there, with an average of that. So even the scientific journals are saying you could essentially get human genetic diversity from that. Now, here's what they're having to deal with. They're having to assume we evolved out of something into something.
Okay.
If you take that out of something apart, you really kind of collapse that whole structure. So So there's a lot going on there. But I would say, with junk DNA, design folks called it.
Yes.
And I think we're seeing some more cases of that. You're familiar with the work of Nathaniel Jeanson, probably. He's doing some great work on the Y chromosome and showing that really you can map, human population back in a biblical timeline. You can map the diversity back to
a historical Adam and Eve.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Which is really exciting. So again, it's pointing to areas where scientific study seem to be getting us closer to what a biblical framework has said all along.
That's right. Yes.
Again, I think that's one of the most exciting things in science right now. Obviously, I'm a Christian. I can get excited about those types of things. But if we're being intellectually honest, we have to be open to all possibilities. And those possibilities are becoming more and more prevalent. Can you think of anything else where design is offering insight?
Yeah, I will say this. There is a growing community of creation scientists, design scientists working alongside of engineers. As we think about life, if life was designed, it is in essence engineered. And so can we use principles of engineering to help us understand life as a designed entity, but not just understand it? Can that actually teach us things about how life works and how life should work? So as we look at the cell, as we think of it from an engineered perspective, does that give us insight into how it functions and why it functions the way it does? And I think that it does, because if we strip away the evolutionary assumption that it's this way because evolution willed it, and we put in there, maybe these things are here for a purpose rather than leftover evolutionary baggage, maybe that gives us some insight into what's going on there. And so there are scientists out there right now working on projects like that. There are papers in the process of being written and submitted with that focus. So I don't want to go into some of that because I don't want to, jeopardize any of that work. But I'll say this, there are a number of projects going on right now by folks, and these are PhD level folks. Okay, these are folks that are serious about science, they're serious about engineering, and they're actually trying to take a deep look at this and say, what do we understand? Not too long ago, there was an engineer that published a paper detailing the engineering specs of the flagellum, the bacterial flagellum, the little rotary motor. And he basically said, I'm gonna write this up just like we were designing an engineering spec for a motor or an engine or something. And so broke out all the components and their purposes and their sizes and what they did and looked at it from that perspective. It's a really fascinating study.
And even deans of major engineering departments are now looking at nature from a design perspective. I think what you mentioned earlier is really powerful in that instead of trying to explain the cell, for instance, through fully natural processes, it would be kind of like you look at a guitar on the wall, whatever it might be, right? Or a camera. And you're looking at that from a perspective of, well, did an intelligence design this for a very specific purpose? If you're looking at something like a camera, if you're looking at something like a musical instrument, whatever it might be, you're going to come away with the idea, well, yes, it took a lot of thought, it took a lot of intelligence, and it took a tremendous amount of engineering to pack all of that into a tiny space where it was fully functional, right?
That's right.
But we're finding the exact same types of components, engineering components within human biology, within animal design, within plants.
That's right.
And then you have, even within a universal scale, right? With the galaxy, with the solar system, all of these things. So then you have to ask yourself, well, why am I ashamed to admit that this looks designed? And if it has engineering principles, then who is the grand engineer? Right? Because we can take it one step further and put a biblical perspective on it. If everything is engineered, there must be a grand engineer. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. I think it was Francis Crick that said,
biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Wow. It's interesting that he had to put that little proviso in there, because it's like he said, man, this really looks like it was designed or engineered. Yeah. And we see that at the deepest level. I study the biochemical level. And as you think about copying the DNA, all of the things that go into that, we see not just that it can copy, but we see error correction, right? So it can actually fix mistakes, right? So it has its own proof. We actually call it proofreading. Wow. Enzymes have proofreading. Some of these polymerases are able to proofread and actually back up and edit and then keep going forward as they go.
That's like an assembly line in a factory.
Oh, sure, yeah.
With robotics that are programmed control. And all. Mm-hmm. How does that just happen? Yeah. Is there a way to, I mean, what hurdles still exist with the concept of design in science?
Yeah, so I think where we are in our process is really trying to think through robustly, what are the implications? If these things were designed, what are the implications? And then how do we approach our research differently knowing that? Yeah. In other words, finding questions, finding things that maybe we haven't figured out or solved yet, and then looking at those things from a design perspective to saying, okay, if this is a design system, which we think it is, what would we expect would be the solution to this? Okay. And so that's the kind of things we're trying to pursue. The challenge is, of course, people in my position, we're not trained to think that way. Uh-huh. Okay, so if someone goes to engineering school, they're trained to think design and process and engineering. But if you've got folks like me going through biochemistry, we're not designed to, or we're not trained with that kind of language.
Yes.
And so we're having to kind of think of it and think together and say, okay, I can sit down with an engineer and say, all right, this is what I'm seeing. And they can say, all right, this is what this looks like in our world. When you have a system that does this, we expect to see these features. Okay. And that's where we start to kind of bring things together. But the challenge is really being able to cross that language barrier of engineering and biology and biochemistry to be able to communicate that
But
together.
If you can figure that out, then all of a sudden there may be another level of predictability.
That's right.
That we can use for this argument within the any scientific field, right?
That's right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If we can build out, and there's actually effort being put toward building what's called a theory of biological design. Okay. Which isn't so much per se about was it a young Earth, old Earth, whatever. It's more about just the concept that if life is designed, what are the characteristics and aspects we would expect? What do we predict based upon that? And I think we see a lot of those facets already out there. We see process controls. We see feedback loops. We see negative and positive feedback loops that control these different systems. We see crosstalk and communication. We see signal integration, and we also see diversity of signals. And so as we kind of look at that, it's like, okay, these are following a lot of rules that we see at play in engineered systems, computer systems. I don't want to reduce the cell and its function down to a computer, but there's some analogy there. All of that, quote, extra DNA is analogous to what happens when you send an email. When you send an email, you send a message, right? But there's a bunch of extra data that is encoded in there that you never see that helps that message get to where it's supposed to get to. And we think of, okay, we've got the message of the protein, but there's all this metadata outside of that that is needed so that the cell knows when and where and how to make that and so forth. And so if you think of it from that perspective, it kind of makes sense.
That's amazing. And the same thing was said, we might be able to say, for vestigial organs, right? Sure. There was at one point where there may have been over 100 vestigial organs, supposedly evolutionary leftovers from our ascent from ape-like creature to humankind. Sure. And as medicine progresses, we're finding that people are finding function for nearly every single supposed vestigial or leftover organ. Mm-hmm. So all of science in multiple fields are pointing this way, and yet it is still not something that is very popular in today's world. Yeah. If there are, for those who are younger, maybe they're about to go to college, maybe they're in university right now. Yeah. They're trying to process this. Any advice? How should they be thinking about it? Can you give them clues? Yeah. So I would say this. I would say separate the facts, the data, from the interpretation. Learn to do that, and you will do well.
we are so used to seeing the interpretation. That's the headline, right? Yeah. The headline is the interpretation. New fossil finds, so many million years old, connects humans to whatever. We're used to seeing the interpretation. Think back critically, what's the actual facts? What are we actually seeing? What has been discovered? And if students can learn to do that early on, they can start to wade through some of the evolutionary jargon and actually see what's going on and what is the actual fact or data that's being considered. We couch a lot of things in that kind of language, and we need to learn to reinterpret it in light of, okay, what are the actual facts, and then how does that fit a biblical framework? So there's a lot of great resources. You're producing some, and there's others out there for folks that can really help them.
Thank you. And we're sitting here in the Wonder Center and Science Museum. We just recently opened up to the public. We're trying to produce resources from a scientific perspective that also talks about the design and complexity of life. And ultimately, we connect that to a biblical, historical account. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, in the last few moments, if someone's in university right now and they don't want to stand up against their professor, just 20 seconds, what could you advise them?
Yeah, I would say pick your battles, be wise, be careful. Yeah. You want, what is your ultimate goal, right? Do you want your goal to be met up with, well, I'm going to go up against this professor and probably lose, or do I have a much bigger goal in mind? So think about what your goals are and pick your battles wisely. It's not necessarily worth your time or effort to go debate somebody that's, not really interested in listening.
Right.
And so definitely be wise and be careful about what you put your time and energy toward. Use
your platform for research, for learning, so that then you can go out and have an impact for good. Thank you, Dr. Joe Deweese, for being here today. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate you being here, and I would love to pick your brain a little bit more on another episode.
Let's do it.
All right. And thank you for joining us on Changing the Narrative. I'm David Rives, and until next time, I want you to keep looking up, because truly, the heavens declare the glory of God. Find us on all social platforms to stay informed. Watch Genesis Science Network 24/7 for free on Roku, Fire TV, and on our website. Visit the world's largest origins-based store, creationsuperstore.com. Plan your trip to the Wonders Center and Science Museum just outside of Nashville, Tennessee.